Today we're going to discuss and demonstrate preliminary bending of orthodontic wires. So first, to understand the bending of orthodontic wire, we want to talk about what the end result really needs to look about. So just basic bending, you want to create a 45-degree angle, and I always say it looks like a tabletop. So it's got two little legs on either side, and then it's got a top right there. So the legs need to be 45-degree angle to the wire. So always keep that in mind when you're bending wire. Also, it doesn't need to be a really large bend. Think about the size of the bracket and the area in which you're going to affect. So why do we put bends in wires? We want to think about moving a tooth in a certain direction. So for instance, I just made this really small bend here to kind of explain what the wire bending does. So if I have a bend in a wire that looks like this, like I said, that little tabletop right there, it's going to nestle inside of a bracket. And in this case, you can see that that is going to push that tooth inward or toward the gingiva. So that's a type of bend that's going to affect tension placed on that bracket and push that tooth and move that tooth in a certain direction. So that's the reasons that we do have wire bends in arch wires. So we have what we call first order bends. And those first order bends are basically keeping a bend within the same plane of the wire, but we're going to move the tooth either buccally or lingually. So that's a first order bend. So how do we create a first order bend? Let's talk about the buccal and the lingual bends, the first order bending. So I'm going to gather myself an arch wire because that's where we're going to place the bend on. And we want to think about the actual patient's mouth, okay? So when you are first getting an arch wire that's going to fit that patient's mouth, instead of painfully putting that into the patient's mouth, you're going to have these nice orthodontic models. So refer to that orthodontic model and lie that arch wire on the model, and you can decide about how much needs to be trimmed, okay? So now when we are looking to make a bend, and let's say we're going to do a lingual bend. A lingual bend, again, is going to be pushing that tooth or placing forces on that tooth to push that tooth toward the tongue, okay? So let's look at that. When we are placing the wire, we want to measure where that bracket is located on the tooth if you had the study model. So right here, I know that if I want to put a lingual bend on tooth number 19, I'm going to make a mark on the mesial and the distal of that bracket because that's where I want that bend to nestle into that bracket. Measure that mesial, could put a little mark there and a little bit on that distal. Now I'm actually making the bend. I'm always going to use a wire bending plier. It has a square side on one side and has a round side on the other, and they both serve their purpose. So if we're moving lingually, we always want to bend against the square part of that plier, okay? So I'm going to bring up this arch wire, and let me see if I can find my little dot again. So I'm going to go place my arch wire, and I'm going lingually, right? So I'm going to put the square part of the plier right mesial to my dot. And then I'm going to make sure that this is perpendicular, perfectly perpendicular to the plane of the arch wire. So that's mesial to that dot, and I'm going to bend against the square part of the plier. So I'm going to use my strongest digit is my thumb. So sometimes that wire can be very, very firm. I'm going to keep it within the same plane, but I'm going to move it, again, 45 degrees. And keep it within that same plane of that arch wire. Okay, so I'm moving it lingually, right? And that looks like it's about 45 degrees. Now I'm going to rotate this plier so I can create that table leg like I talked about at the beginning. And I'm going to put it just distal to that dot. And remember, I have to bend against the square part of the wire. So now I'm going to bring it back around. I'm going to bend this, and I'm going to put it, basically, the arch wire back how it was before. Now I'm just going to remove that plier so I can show you got our first little table leg. It's about 45 degrees. Now I'm going to move my plier, keeping the square side on the part toward the cheek. And I'm going to move it to the next little dot right there. And keeping it perpendicular again. All first order bends are made with your plier perpendicular to your arch wire. I'm going to bend back at about 45 degrees, keeping it in the same plane. I was off a little bit there, so I better correct it. And then I'm going to rotate my plier because now I'm going to come back and put it all back in the same plane again. And now you can see it's back in the same form basically that it was at the beginning. So now you can see that I have a lingual bend. So that bend is going towards the tongue. If I were to place that on the actual typodont here, you can see how that bend would be going in toward the tongue. Okay, so that's a lingual bend, and that's one type of a first order bend. Now we're going to do the opposite on the other side. We're going to do another first order bend, which is called a buccal bend. Just like it sounds, it's going to move and put tension on that tooth to move buccally, move towards the cheek, right? So again, I'm going to mark the mesial and the distal. And this time I'm really just doing the opposite. I'm going to put the square part of the plier on the mesial dot, just mesial to that first dot, right? But my square part of my plier is going to be buccally. It's going to be on the buccal side of that arch wire. That makes sense, doesn't it? And I'm going to move, the first bend is going to be moving buccally because I'm going to be pushing that out toward that cheek. I'm going to try to. Now I'm going to turn this around. And you have to have a really good firm grip, I will tell you that, because now your plier really becomes your vise, so to speak. So it's really hard, it's really holding that wire very firmly as you apply those forces to really make that bend. Now I'm going to keep it on the same side, go to the next dot, bring it back to make that second table leg, so to speak, at 45 degrees, and then bring it back in to the same plane as it was before, in the same overall form as it was before. And there you go. That's the buccal bend. Okay, so if I were to put that on the typodont, again, you would see that that's in the same plane of the arch wire. It's just going to put forces on that bracket to hopefully move that tooth in a buccal fashion out toward the cheek. Okay, so both of those are first order bends. That's your buccal and your lingual bend.